everyone. It's now 9:30 and time for the start of day 8 into the examination hearings. My name is Mike Fox. I'm the inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to conduct the examination into the Mid-Sussex Site Allocations DPD. We are being recorded on YouTube, so you can see yourselves afterwards if you want to do that. When people speak, that's the time to introduce yourselves. So I'm not going to go around the table right at the outset like we would do at a physical hearing, and also say who you're representing while you do that. We'll have breaks. We'll have one around 11, a lunch break between 1 and 2, and then we have a separate session this afternoon starting at 2 on transport and infrastructure, and there'll be another break around 3:30 then. So this morning we'll be discussing matter 4, the environment. As of last night, the action points weren't up on the examination websites. I know this is a question for Andrew Marsh. If they're not up, can they please go up today?
So I checked this morning and I've had notification from our IT team. They are up now.
They are. That's excellent. Thank you very much for that. So we'll start on matter 4. Unless there are any further points of either procedure or anything that Charlotte wishes to say. If not, then no. Right, shaking of head. Right, so matter 4, are the plan's provisions for the protection and enhancement of its environmental, landscape, biodiversity and heritage assets justified and in accordance with national policy? And little 4.1 just talks generally about these policies and how effective they are. And the council's response, reminding us that this is a daughter document of the district plan, and the district plan has a wide range of policies that seek to protect and enhance the district's environmental, landscape, biodiversity and heritage assets in accordance with national policy. During the preparation of this plan, there's been extensive consultation with a number of statutory consultees, such as Historic England, Natural England, the National Park Authority and Sussex Wildlife Trust, and the Aomb units as well. And we also have a policy essay gen, which we've talked about before, which is relevant in this context. CPRE state that there's been a failure to get to grips with habitats change. There should be an overarching climate change policy. The Sussex Wildlife Trust, again, saying that there should be a strategic climate change mitigation and adaptation policy. And they recommend looking at either the Worthing Local Plan Policy SP2 or the Hastings Local Plan Policy OSP1, which comprise elements addressing carbon reduction, maximising carbon sequestration, and climate change adaptation and mitigation. So we can discuss that in a while. Michael Fell states that wildlife should be respected by development wherever possible, and gives some real life examples from his own experience, which are very interesting. Childmark Consulting state that the strategic gap showing the policies maps around the Crawley boundary towards East Grinstead is important, but feel that the policy in general is flawed on this, especially around Turner's Hill. DMH Stallard for Welbeck strategic land, that the district plan and the evidence base supports policy SA20, which is also supported by the LVA and talks about the details of that particular site. Gladman Development states basically that they are querying the council's justification to allocate land in the Aomb, given in their words that there's been a willingness to deviate from the requirements of policy DP6 elsewhere. Sigma planning for Ryden's homes, that the plan should not include generic development control policies. So those are the main points under 4.1. Is there anything the council want to start off with by way of introduction on this?
Oops, sorry, so I'm trying to. I don't think so, sir, not at the moment. Probably easier, I think, to hear from other people and we'll respond. Thank you.
Okay. All right. I'm having problems with my screen at the moment. It is not indicating any hands up facilities. I'm not sure what's going on here, Charlotte. Are you able to sort of intervene on this, or is that not technically possible? Oh, I see I've got Jess Price now.
Yeah, there wasn't any hands up until Jess put hers up.
Right. Okay. Jess Price, welcome to our proceedings.
Thank you. Yes, I'm from the Sussex Wildlife Trust. Apologies, I was just a bit slow off the mark. Yeah, I think you summarised our position. We have been in consultation with the council, particularly regarding SA Gen. We do think that policy is positive, and they made improvements over the various consultations to it, particularly around net gains to biodiversity, which we very much support. But we do agree with CPRE Sussex submission regarding climate change that there's no overarching strategic policy or really clear policy around it. Our main concern is on the mitigation side. Adaptation is mentioned through a few of the policies in the district plan and in SA Gen, but the MPPF in particularly paragraphs 20 and 149 really are clear about the need for mitigation and adaptation and a proactive approach to that. And the dictionary definition of mitigation is making something less severe, i.e. making climate change less severe. The only way to do that is to reduce emissions and increase sequestration of carbon. And as far as we can see, there's no real policy around doing that when compared to other local authorities who are being proactive in that manner, which I put two examples, but there are others in the wider country, particularly Manchester. So we do feel that that's something that's missing from both the district plan and now the sites plan as well.
Thank you very much for that. Michael Brown, do come in.
Good morning, sir. Michael Brown, CPRE Sussex.
Good morning.
I wrongly thought I was going to be talking about air pollution before and SA 38 before climate change, but let me change tack and just talk, if I may, for a couple of minutes about what I think is a significant deficiency in the draft document as regards climate change policy. And I'm going to proceed on the basis that this is in the same way as the council has argued that the air quality policy is a necessary policy within this daughter document to give effect to all other policies. From my perspective, exactly the same justification exists for a proper strategy on climate change. So I'm going to proceed on the basis that that's on that basis, and I know you will rule on the legal point in due course. And at the end of what I'm going to say to you, I'm going to make a suggestion at how we might wish to consider dealing with the matter if you accept the argument that the plan is defective in terms of its climate change strategy and policies such as they are. Global warming threatens us all with extreme heat, extreme weather events, water scarcity leading to loss of human life, population migration, coastal loss, flooded habitations, food insecurity, biodiversity loss, and so on. All of them on a global scale, and all of them are happening now. Politicians are rising to the challenge, with the UK committed to playing its part in seeking to cap temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, and with a legally binding promise to achieve net zero carbon emissions no later than 2050. Last December, the Committee on Climate Change, the CCC, which is the body set up by government to advise on what it needs to do to realise that net zero statutory target, advised that the country needs to be 78% on the way to that target by 2035. And the government has accepted that recommendation, and there's a regulation in front of Parliament which is expected to be passed this month, turning government policy into statutory obligation. We also need to be aware that the CCC has advised government that it's already falling behind on its current 5th carbon budget to 2030. As part of the evidence base justifying its 78% target reduction, the CCC published a report, and I've provided you with a link to it in my written statement, on the critical role that local planning authorities need to play if that target is to be reached. The CCC report highlights that local authorities influence 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions, and that the principal tool of influence is the use of their planning and placemaking powers. The CCC has calculated that local planning authorities need to achieve an annual 9% reduction in their area's emissions. Local authorities have been required since 2008 to include within their development plan documents policies designed to secure that the development and use of land in the local planning authority's area contribute to the mitigation and adaptation to climate change. Climate change permeates every level of the planning process. As para 12 of the NPPF emphasises that an LPA's development plan is the starting point for decision making, the local plan is the place to set out the planning authority's strategy for the exercise of its powers and responsibility to influence land use, development projects, and as a driver of change in all our behaviours. It is clear that in the last couple of years, there's been a wellspring of concern at local government level that has not hitherto been widely apparent. 241 of England's 292 local planning authorities have declared a climate emergency, and 3/4 of them have set a net zero target at least 10 years ahead of the national 2050 target. Only 51 dinosaur authorities still have their heads in the sand. Many authorities are putting their planning policies where their mouths are, and are in the course over the last couple of years of either designing or updating comprehensive policies specifically responding to their climate emergency declarations. To take just one example, last week I was listening to the head of planning at Lancaster District Council, who was explaining that their local plan adopted last year was only approved by the Planning Inspectorate on the condition that the council undertake an immediate review of their planning policies with a view to the further examination of those changes. This has led to their re-examining 13 strategic policies and 19 development policies within their plan, I'm told. These revisions are scheduled to be the subject of a further public examination next year. Mid Sussex is, to the best of my knowledge, one of those few authorities that has not publicly accepted that a climate change exists, and has not joined the ranks of those authorities that have acted to update their development plans to explain how they would prioritise climate change mitigation in the exercise of their planning policies and planning decisions. This sites allocation DPD process would have been the perfect opportunity for them to do so and to stay ahead of the game. Instead, whilst the clock continues to tick, we have a district plan that runs to 2031, just 4 years before the country has to achieve a 78% reduction in its greenhouse gas emissions compared to 1990, with no strategic climate change policy at all. Climate change merely being one of 15 priority themes that plays out as a factor in a few individual policies that I've identified to you in my written submission. There's no net zero target date, no high-level strategy to get to net zero, no minimum targets in terms of home energy standards or sustainable transport use, etc. No ability to monitor effectively, no priority, proactive requirements. Council hasn't even set up an archery target needed to shoot at. That simply isn't good enough to enable the council to demonstrate that its spatial planning and land use policies will achieve what the NPF para 149 calls the radical reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and resilience improvements required, or that they are justified by reference to national policy, especially the new policy to achieve a 78% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, where the council needs to be able to demonstrate that it is on a trajectory to contribute to that binding target. As matters stand, it simply cannot do that, and for that reason alone, it is not now a sound plan. CPRE has developed a checklist of criteria for effective climate change local plan strategy and some best practice policies taken from a sample of other authorities. We're happy to share those and discuss them with the council if that's helpful. CPRE Sussex does not ask you to defer endorsement of the site's allocation DPD until it includes a suitable sound set of climate change policies and effective monitoring provisions. We recognise that the development of suitable policies will be a time-consuming process. But the experience of other authorities suggests that if a council puts its mind to it, it is an exercise that can be done in 18 months or so. With that in mind, we ask that you direct the council, in whatever way is the most appropriate, to undertake an immediate, broad and thorough review and upgrade of its district plan policies, and include them within the 5-year plan review that they have now commenced, on the basis that the soundness of that review will depend, amongst other things, on the council demonstrating at examination that it has climate change policy that passes all the tests of soundness. Thank you, sir.
I'll bring other people in before I come back to the council and before I respond to CPRE. I'll take Chris Huff next. Good morning, Mr. Huff.
Morning, sir. Morning, all. Chris Huff of Sigma Planning on behalf of Ryden Homes. So basically, support climate change policies generally, but this isn't the right plan for it. This is a site allocations DPD, which is an offspring of the adopted plan. The issues of climate change should and have been taken into account in the selection of sites, and that should be evident from the sustainability appraisals. Not saying that policies on climate change aren't important, they are, and they're already in the adopted plan, and they'll be updated in the review in due course. And I don't think it's right to bring in policies, generic policies, on a piecemeal basis at this stage. It should be part of the overall review, and then it can filter into every policy in the overall local plan. That's why I have an objection to SA 34 to 38, because they're not in the main directly related to site allocations, and the key is in the name of the plan. It's the site allocations document, not a review of the local plan. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Lopez, do come in.
Sir, good
Mr.
morning.
Lopez.
Can you see and hear me okay?
I can see you, I can hear you.
Very good, good to see you again. On behalf of Infrastructure First then, and I'm a planning barrister, speaking primarily to the issues concerning the Ashdown Forest SPA and SAC, as you'll know from our representation. But might I firstly endorse and adopt, if it adds any weight to it, what you've heard from the representees so far in terms of climate change impacts. So you'll be aware that that's not a matter that we spoke to in our written representations before you, but what's been said, I think, is very well framed and eloquently set out. So can we formally adopt that? And with that, can I turn to the SPA and SAC impacts? And your question is very carefully framed, if I might say, in terms of the likely significant effects that you might find from plan making at this stage, with all of the gravitas of the duty, which effectively binds you in terms of what you are concerned to find and assess at this plan making stage. And so the context for that, I think, is a neat starting point, is an observation on the inspector's report, Inspector Bohr, in terms of the allocations in 2018. So it's the district plan approval report, isn't it? And there's a paragraph within there. Can I just lend you a reference? So it's 2.18 within that report, where the inspector there was concerned, and justifiably, as to the significant, likely significant impacts of the increased trajectory, as he framed it, from 2024 to 2025. So 2.18 within his report. And what he carefully framed at that stage, and I appreciate that that is a little bit more than a snapshot in time, but it's a historic finding upon the assessment, but it's a neat starting point, I think, for us, a valid one, is that there should be no further harm to the integrity of European habitat sites in Ashdown Forest, is what he stated clearly at 2.18. And that was perfectly correct at that stage. It's not enough to point to that as applying with the same significance today, but it offers you, as I say, a very neat starting point. Then comes the DPD itself and the alarm that Infrastructure First have in terms of and respectfully put, the rather cavalier and overly broad, and we are bound to add unevidenced conclusion that is framed at 2.33, which says, and forgive me for reading this out, but there is a certain emphasis that I want to offer up. It reads that using the evidence-based justifications, the HRA has concluded at this stage of plan making that the site allocations DPD does not present any potential risks to the Ashdown Forest SPA and SAC that are not capable of being mitigated. And so what it's trying to offer in a very broad, and I think overly broad way, and certainly not a way in which is well evidenced in the base document or in the evidence base, and we have read through it very carefully, as you would expect, is to support the justification that the allocations will not give rise to any potential risks that cannot be mitigated. Now, that's a first thought before I go on to explore what mitigations are within the basket in order to give rise to that conclusion in the first place. So I say the conclusion is flawed for being far too broad and lacking a clear evidence base, or at least one that's stated in front of you. You'll have heard representations already, I think week 1, where we dipped into certain representations whereby the council were floating the spectre of future monitoring. And so I raised a question mark then, and I said I would revisit it at this stage. So here we go. From 2.3.3 then, we are asked to explore with some confidence monitoring and future monitoring, because you know, as a matter of historic record, that the latest monitoring in terms of Ashdown SBA was 2016. So you know, in respect of East Court and Ashplas Wood and the SANG that's operational there, the latest monitoring of that, our record, lest we be corrected by the council, is 2013. And so what you immediately appreciate in terms of the evidence base on hearing from the council again, and if we can be corrected on the record, we will be, I'm sure, is that there has been no monitoring as a matter of fact, first. Second, the council accept that such monitoring is an essential component and an ongoing component of the mitigation strategy. And I do stress ongoing, so hold that thought, because I'm going to take you to the conclusions section of the HRA study itself in a moment. And so it's not as if the council were positing during the first week that the monitoring strategy must be given an opportunity to bed in, and it can begin in a given future year. The accent, the emphasis is upon ongoing now. And so with that, can I ask you please to take a further pen reference, please, of the HRA itself. And I do that in the context of Natural England's representation, because often it's said, it won't be a new one on you, to say that where a Natural England convey a representation in fairly clear terms, and with the headline thought they do not object, it's often said, well, because NE are who they are, you ought to attach considerable weight to that. And there's lukewarm authority to that effect. But I say lukewarm because it's caveated by understanding the frame, how that representation from NE, whether they object or they support, is framed. And it requires of the decision taker a fair exploration of the evidence base, which sits underneath that representation. And why I say that, and hopefully that's a fair characterization of the legal authorities when one's concerned with a representation from Natural England, but in shorthand fashion. And why I say that is that NE's representation is very clearly put, but it doesn't allow the council to get home respectfully in terms of the future monitoring strategy and their approach to it, which is embedded within the Reg 19 HRA, because they put it this way, which is paragraph, further pen reference for you, sir, paragraph 5.41 of the HRA, which talks about the importance of the monitoring strategy, and it casts it as but one example of a monitoring aspect that may pick up particular trends, recreational trends, in access to Ashdown. And it frames it no less than as an important component, I say rightly, so I agree with this much, an important component of the mitigation strategy. So to take you back to Natural England's representation, what they say is that they agree the headline conclusions of the HRA, and in shorthand again, they are content not to object on the basis of the conclusions as put. And so when you look to the conclusion section of the DPD HRA, further paragraph reference 6.6, and I read all of the conclusion section, indeed the HRA as a whole, of course, but one emphasis of this, bearing in mind the way in which NE's representation is framed, final line, page 85, internal pagination, paragraph 6.6 on conclusions. However, it is essential that work continues, and that there's a typo there, but one gets the emphasis of it. Work continues to monitor the mitigation delivery for recreation, ensuring SAM measures are effectively targeted and SAM contributions effectively spent to ensure that mitigation is effective. So what that part of 6.6 and indeed the whole of the conclusion section, which is cross-referenced within NE's representation, is getting at, is that mitigation, that part of the mitigation basket ought to have already begun, ought to have been ongoing, should not have been paused in the way that it so graphically has. Again, on the Ashdown SPA, not since 2016 is our record, and on Ashplatz, not since 2013. And that sort of break is not only inexcusable, we say, in terms of the duty to be confident in terms of likely significant effects subject to mitigation, and then one goes on to explore the robustness and effectiveness of the overall mitigation. It is incumbent within the decision taker to be confident, to be sure that the legal test is met. And if one is presented in that context with an evidence base that is as loose and as broadly framed as this one, respectfully to the authors that it is, I'm afraid when one reads that in conjunction with specifically what Natural England have very clearly stated, it doesn't support the conclusion that the council, outwardly at least, are said to be confident about. And that's why from an early stage, and we couldn't have come any earlier than week 1, and you'll have read the fullness of our representation, we were making it very clear that we were interested to hear from the council in depth in regards to their reliance on the mitigation strategy, or that component of monitoring. They frame it as important, as almost pivotal, but nonetheless on the ground have not carried it out. So it doesn't really turn respectfully on the reasons why. It really turns on the fact that they haven't carried it out. And it necessarily follows, we say, that they cannot be confident. And similarly, respectfully to you, sir, but don't feel this is a bind, but rather more as a persuasive invitation, if you like, you cannot be confident either that the SANG itself will provide for adequate mitigation to reduce down what the HRA itself inevitably observes will be the likely significant impacts on the Ashdown SPA and SAC. So, sir, we pose that question to the council very politely, and I hope clearly enough, as a follow-up to our 4.5 representation. And to date, we haven't respectfully heard any convincing answer to that question. And the council, in fairness to them, are in a difficult place, that they can't excuse the fact that they haven't, as a matter of fact, carried out the monitoring that they themselves say is so important as an ongoing exercise. As again, it's not answered to say that the exercise can begin in a future term or a future year. That time has been and gone, if one's to rely on this evidence base as it stands today. So that is at the front of our concerns in relation to the finding of significant likely impacts of SA19, SA20, such as they are cited in relation to the SPA and SAC. We respectfully have had full regard to the evidence base. We've posed the right questions, we think, at the right time. There's no last minute ambushing here, but respectfully to the council, I think they find themselves in a place where they can't excuse factually what hasn't taken place, and they're having to row back, I think, in terms of their own evidence base. It is respectfully no good pointing to NE's representation when you read it literally. It doesn't help the council when you cross-reference it with the HRA document. So on the face of the documents and the evidence base, we remain terribly concerned in the context of the legal duty with regards to the impacts that we have identified alongside the evidence base that exists. So I think
I'll just stop you there for a minute, Mr. Lopez. I've been very slow in responding to this, but in fact, the matter you're talking to is my question 4.5, and we're on question 4.1. So we will come to your very well made presentation, but I want to put it in the context of what other representations are saying about the same topic. And rather than bring them in now and completely mess up the batting order, if you can be patient with me, we will come back to you on this. And what I'd just like to ask you is, have you got anything on the overall 4.1 matter which you can help me with?
I saw Mr. Brown coming on visual. I wish he'd waved as well. He's very polite not to interject, but so I might bank everything I've said for your later matter, but I wish you'd stop me. Let me just check with my client on 4.1. Madam, sir, respectfully not. So,
Well, glad to get that, because I first haven't actually made a statement on 4.1. So, which is what I didn't want to interject. I did put my camera on a couple of times in the hope of saying, is this really what we should be talking about at this point in the proceedings?
Right. Thank you, Mr. Brown. Unfortunately, my screen is not showing what I hoped it would show. I'm going to have to sort this out during the coffee break, I think. So I'm batting blind to an extent. But if what I want now is, are there any other comments on 4.1 from the parties? And then I would like the council's response. We can just go back about half an hour or so to a possible policy on climate change. Do we have any more comments on 4.1? In which case, Mr. Brown or your team, could somebody respond to the points that we've heard from CPRE and from the Wildlife Trust, who are advocating a proactive policy, as well as from Mr. Huff, who is saying this is entirely the wrong place to put it, and that it's fairly obvious through the sustainability appraisal that sustainability work, climate change work has already gone into the plan. So you've got those two like twin representations, if I can put it like that. I'd just like to hear what your view is, Mr. Brown.
Thank you, sir. I'll kick off, and if I've missed anything out, Mr. Marsh will chip in at the end. So we very much position ourselves alongside what you've heard from Mr. Huff of Sigma. And so I want to begin by saying, this is not a council which is a climate change denier. I noticed Mr. Brown in his submission said the council doesn't recognise climate change. And he used the words dinosaurs. So that is emphatically not the case. As Mr. Huff has pointed out to you, climate change is recognised. It's picked up in the existing district plan in a number of places. I recognise those policies do not go as far as the sorts of policies that Mr. Brown has suggested, but climate change is very clearly referenced in the district plan. As Mr. Huff has indicated, climate change has been one of the matters that the council's had in its mind in the selection of sites. It's why we are looking for more sustainable sites, which are likely to generate less in the way of transport or vehicular movements, and all those sorts of considerations. So that the question is not whether or not the district plan or the local plan as a collection of DPDs should have policies on climate change. The question is whether this site allocations DPD is the place to do it. And so it's our view that it's not, for all the reasons that have been advanced by Mr. Huff and others in relation to whether or not there should be more wide-ranging strategic plans. So as you know, there are already SA 34 to SA 38 some strategic policies there. The council has set out its stall. It believes that those are all very definitely tied to the allocations and are, as it were, daughter policies of those from the main district plan. But so you know that already we are under criticism from a number of quarters for even having gone that far. And indeed, that's one of the reasons why you've asked for a note from us on SA 34 to SA 38. To explain why even these policies should be in the SA DPD. So our view is that to insert an entirely new policy on climate change would be going too far. It would be going beyond the scope of a daughter document. But sir, I want to stress that the reason for that is not because as a council, we are in any sense in a stage of sort of climate change denial. It's not in any sense because we do not appreciate that there will be a need for such policies in the emerging district plan review. But it is the district plan review that is where those changes should take place. And so that ties in with what Mr. Brown said to you in terms of timescales. He said, well, it shouldn't take that long to do. 18 months or so would be sufficient. And he asked you to direct us to upgrade and review the district plan. Well, sir, there's no need for you to direct us to do that. We are already in the process of doing it. And the points which CPRE has made in terms of net zero, those sorts of things, those will all be considered in that context. But that is the right place to do it and not this site allocations document. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for that. I think what would be helpful from my point of view will be a short note on the council's approach to climate change, just really kind of arguing on the lines that you have said, which we can put in, other parties can respond to that, because clearly it's very much of the moment. It's catching up with all of us at a very fast rate of knots. I can understand the urgency that people like Jess and Michael Brown have said, and it's important that we are all aware of that, and they're important national policy undertakings. But I think it would be helpful for this plan for you to have a note as to how this plan has taken into account climate change in coming to in the essay, for example. And it's not for me to tell you how to do that, but I just want you to give me a note on how this council has taken into account the very important climate change considerations.
Indeed, sir, we can do that. And so perhaps I should just add that if you were to conclude that actually the site allocations plan, it would be necessary to make it sound, in terms of the general message that would send, I don't think the council would have a difficulty with that as a matter of principle. As I've said, we're very definitely signed up to addressing climate change. I think the concern that the council would have would be potential implications for the timescale for adopting the site allocations DPD, and whether it might make more sense in that context, given that the district plan review is following closely on its heels, just to park it to then. Certainly, if it's going to mean something of the order of an 18-month period for delay in the site allocations, then there is almost no benefit to be gained by doing it that way. But so we can pick those points up in our note to you. Thank you.
That'll be very helpful. Jess Price, do come in.
Thank you. Yes, I think the Sussex Wildlife Trust is in alignment with CPRE Sussex that, and the council, that we wouldn't want to see a huge delay for the site allocations document. And we would really appreciate the note from the council on climate change. Sorry to labour the point, but it would be really helpful if it did address both mitigation and adaptation, because that's where we feel mitigation is where we feel maybe it's a bit vaguer. And with the greatest respect, in terms of the need of a direction from you for the review of the local plan, I'm sure Michael might agree with me that we feel it probably would be helpful, because climate change was raised quite significantly during the examination for the local plan, and the council weren't so I don't know what the word is, forthcoming that time, and we would really like to make sure that doesn't happen again. So that's why I believe, not to speak for him, but I believe that's why CPRE Sussex is raising it now, and why we support them in that.
Before you go, Ms Price, when you put to me some of the other policies of neighbouring councils who've taken on board climate change, Worthing, for example, I've no idea how long it took them to produce those plans, whether it was 15 months or not. but they're more a kind of set of bullet points of things that the council should have mind to do. How valuable do you think a kind of bullet type policy, if I can be slightly facetious, it can be done in 5 minutes? That kind of policy, how valuable as a stopgap before we get to the main review of this plan, how valuable would that kind of policy be?
I think it can be helpful. The issue for climate change, in our position, is that it's an overarching issue that needs to have an overarching policy, and the way it is currently is it's just dotted here and there. So we feel like climate change should be a number one concern right at the start of a developer planning for a site, and kind of having that weight of this is important. It should be a consideration throughout the design of the development, and right from the beginning, not just an add-on at the end, or just something that can be tick boxed through a flood risk assessment or something like that. So I do feel like there is benefit. I mean, the nature of it, because I'll be perfectly honest, the NPPF is not as strong as I would like on climate change either, and there are restrictions to what the council can do. So
comment on that, I'm afraid.
Exactly. So I think framing it, bullet points are fine, framing it in a way that just kind of collects all the different elements, and of course a good climate change policy will also tick off many of the other requirements of a good plan, in terms of increased walking and cycling and things, which have other benefits and requirements in the NPPF, and good place design and things like that. Really, for the Wildlife Trust, green infrastructure and tree cover in urban areas. So, and I would say as well, to sort of defend the council, that the 2 examples I gave are in plans that haven't been adopted yet. The Worthing one is due for examination, but I know that the one in Manchester has been adopted. So it is a bit of a developing area, but we just felt that the council could be more ambitious and aligned with the other councils in Sussex.
The Manchester plan, I don't know it intimately. Is it a plan which is a part 1 stage, like a strategic plan, or is it more like this plan, a kind of site allocations plan?
I believe it's a strategic plan. I can't remember. It's the Greater Manchester. I think it's because it's a unitary authority. It's a Greater Manchester plan, and it's the strategic plan. I think it's an overarching policy. Michael can probably tell you. I think he's got his hand up from CPRA Sussex. Sorry.
Yes. Is that all you need to say?
Yes. Thank you.
Right. Okay. So I'll bring Michael Brown in again, please.
In answer to the question about the Manchester plan, I do believe it to be a strategic plan. So,
thank you.
You
had your hand up before, though, didn't you? So
I did. My namesake is correct that we are not expecting you to ask for the inclusion of a policy within this plan, because it is a protracted process to produce a thorough review of plan policies. It's easy enough to stick a one-line policy in a plan which says we will get to net zero within Mid-Sussex within, by 2035 or whatever it may be. But a statement like that is meaningless without looking at every policy to work out how you're going to achieve it and set clear targets by which different aspects, be it transport or energy efficiency or building regulations or whatever, are going to achieve that within the district. And it does take a thorough exercise to do it, which is why we've suggested that it can, and time permits, if the council is proactive enough, to get that done as part of the plan review. But like the Wildlife Trust, we think that it is important that the council be given a steer by you in your report, that is an essential component of making the plan sound. Time has moved on since the district plan was adopted. As you said, we're all scrambling to catch up. And there is a lot of activity, as I'm sure you're even more aware than we are, so right across the country in authorities updating their plans. But I think that the council does need to be given a clear directive that it is a necessary component of a review, that there should be updated, clear policies with a target within the plan review.
Now, you've heard from the council, from say your namesake, that in fact that is precisely what the council intend to do with their review. But the question I put to Jess Price was in relation to some of the plans nearby, like the Worthing one, where you've got a set of bullet points to kind of alert you to various things. My question is there any value in a stopgap policy which kind of raises the profile, if you like, of climate change? Yes, Price said it would, in her words, kind of inform other aspects of policies as a kind of add to the checklist of effectiveness of policies. I don't think anybody's disagreeing. I'm not picking up any disagreement that the council have, through its sustainability appraisal and other ways, taken into account climate change in their policy formulation, but it's kind of somewhere hidden a few layers down, if you like. And what I'm really seeking advice from parties on is in raising the profile, which I think is important. Do we do that and say this note will help me, which the council have agreed to write, and other people can comment on it, whether just some statement on that in itself is sufficient, or whether a wording style policy could be included, which is a series of bullet points, and which could be done with almost no delay at all. And I'm also picking up from all of you that waiting for another 15 months is just not going to happen. We're not going to do that. So I'm really seeking what the most appropriate way forward on climate change, which I accept is a strategic thing, but nonetheless, this is the latest plan and this is moving quickly, and it does influence allocations, which is this plan, is what is the most appropriate way forward for a soundness perspective. Do you have anything you can help me with on that, Mr. Brown?
Well, I suppose it would be perfectly sensible and logical to have an interim strategic policy, which could be, I think, fairly simply and drafted in what you call bullet form fashion. Perhaps in the same way as in the district plan, there was a requirement, there is within the district plan a requirement for a review of the impact on Ashdown Forest at a later stage. Perhaps an interim short policy which makes it clear that the profile of climate change is already higher in the council's view, and aiming towards a target that's consistent with national policy, ought to be possible. Ultimately, though, it needs to feed through into the detailed policies at all levels. So it would just be an interim highlight guidance policy, if you like. I see no reason why that can't be done reasonably easily, and ideas borrowed from other authorities that are already working on the same concepts. We've certainly been looking at some sample policies that we think are good policies or draft policies in other authorities as part of a sort of national sort of catch up at CPRE level of what is happening across the country in terms of local plan policies.
And that's one of the values of CPRE and other groups like you, is that you do draw to our attention what's happening in other parts of the country, and that's all to the good. I'll bring your Katie Lamb, do come in on this. Good morning,
Good
Kate.
morning. For those that don't know me, I'm Katie Lamb, DMH Stallard, acting on behalf of Welbeck Strategic. I've been listening to the debate, which of course is a debate that we should all be having and challenging ourselves on. Just very briefly, I had thought that we'd already accepted the principle in the first week that strategic policies were not should not be in the site allocations DPD as a daughter document. And also, it is important, climate change, we should all be thinking about it, and it is coming forward in various guises in primary legislation, such as the Environment Bill, for example. So it is not something that we will be avoiding in the future. It doesn't necessarily need to be in this plan when it can come forwards in the local plan review. And of course, we are all required to deal with climate change through planning applications as well. So I think it is a commitment for the council, it's a commitment for the government, and it will be something that will be delivered on every site. And if a specific strategic policy is necessary, that can come forward in the local plan review. Thank you.
Are you saying for that, Katie Lamb, that some sort of interim raising profile policy is almost not worth the paper it's written on?
I probably wouldn't go as far as that. I think a bit words of mouth a little. Yeah, it might be that the council can have some sort of supporting text in the beginning of the document that shows their commitment to climate change, but I don't think it's necessary because it is delivered through planning applications in any case.
Thank you very much for that. Paul Brown, did you want to just finish off on this one and then we'll move on to 4.2?
So I don't think there's anything I can usefully add at this stage. I mean, our position, I think, is still pretty much where Katie Lamb's submissions have just left you, which is that we think it is better to leave this for the district plan review. Having said that, Sarah, as I indicated earlier, if you felt that some sort of reference, whether in the text or the an interim policy, if you felt that was necessary to make the SADPD sound, it's not as if there's some constitutional or in principle objection to it from Mid Sussex. We're just concerned that that there should not be strategic policies of that kind. Obviously, you would only recommend it if you thought that it was appropriate to have that in an SADPD, but that's not where we've been coming from up until now. And we would be concerned if it led to any sort of significant delays in the adoption of the SADPD. So beyond that,
and I await your note with interest on this, and I'll cogitate further. So that's it for 4.1. I'm going to move on to, and we can make a start on this before coffee in the next half an hour, is on areas of outstanding natural beauty and the High Weald area. And the question 4.2 asks, what is the justification for allocating the proposed number of dwellings in the High Weald Aomb? The council are very clear in stating the importance of the Aomb and the fact they recognise that importance and its status in national policy, but state also that some development must practically occur within the Aomb to support, for example, local needs and the rural economy. The council also states that in their view, none of the sites proposed for allocation in the sites DPD are major developments. They are all modest housing schemes in their words. They refer me to topic paper 1, which sets out the council's understanding of major development in the High Weald Aomb, obviously in the context of paragraph 172 of the MPPF and footnote 55. And also they refer to the Marici opinions, which we briefly looked at last week. And they state in closing, in their statements, that none of the allocations in the DPD, which is 6 for housing and 2 for employment, have been assessed as major development. So that's the council's stance. DHA Planning for Option 2 Developments Limited, they take the line that the level of planned development exceeds what is required for individual settlements. They feel that there is scope for development elsewhere, that there is the issue of the detrimental effect on the environment, and whether in fact these houses are all needed within the locations that they're set up. They then look at, or they then state that 3 of the allocations, SA25 at Ardingly, SA27 at Hancross, and SA29 at Horsted Keynes, are all for what they would consider to be major developments, 70, 65 and 30 respectively for those 3 allocations that I just quoted. He then go on to present me with a list of appeal decisions, which are in the order of 50 to 75 units, and that in this list, every scheme is found by an inspector to constitute major development in the AONB. And they really do not accept the council's explanation, particularly in relation to SA25 at Ardingly, that the reduction from the original figure of 100 to 70 dwellings means that it's not major development. I suppose one of my questions here is, does the council have any response to any of these appeal decisions cited by the DHA? Obviously, none of them are kind of very near here, some are as far away as Cornwall, but it would be interesting to see what parallels or differences you feel there are. And they go on to say that on the basis that the plan of this plan is inconsistent with national policy, it's failed to test reasonable alternative strategies for meeting the residual housing need. Then moving on to Nexus for Miller Homes. They say that the inspector's report to the district plan, Mr. Bohr's report, states that some settlements within the AONB may be appropriate for modest housing schemes, but there is no evidence that meeting the housing requirement will necessitate major development within the AONB, although he does refer to Pease Pottage, but that had already been permitted by that stage. So that's slightly muddying the waters, I think. But in Nexus view, 70 dwellings remains a significant scale, particularly on the edge of a modest rural village, and resulting in a fundamental and irreversible change to the landscape and scenic beauty of the site and wider area. Now, I'm aware that obviously that we went through a lot of this last week, and I will be looking at this site as one of my site visits in either Thursday or Friday. It's on the list that Charlotte's and the council are putting together for me. So I'll be able to look and see whether, in fact, my view is that it would result in a fundamental and irreversible change to the landscape and scenic beauty. Turley for A2 Dominion, go on a different tack altogether, talking about the strategic important relationship with Crawley, which has significant unmet needs, and that there's a significant prospect that land within the AONB will be required in relation to Crawley's needs, and quotes from 2 local plans in Oxfordshire, which are basically saying the nearer the site is to the need, the better. Dr. Helena Griffiths refers me to Horsted Keynes and the fact the village is wholly within the high-wheeled AONB, like Ardingly, and that there are 2 sites there, SA28 and SA29. And Helena Griffiths argues that the density and scale do not enhance the environment, landscape, biodiversity or heritage assets of the AONB. And she therefore, although she then says that she supports appropriate development within the AONB, presumably on sites that she considers don't affect the landscape, biodiversity, etc. We have a representation from Rowan and Julia Plantaros, I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Forgive me if I've got it wrong. They again expressed concern in relation to SA 25 at Ardingly. Draw my attention to the national policy on this. And in their view, this raises a question as to the overall soundness of the plan. Savills for Charterhouse land, again, talking about SA 25, which they support in principle, although they're saying in view of Mid-Sussex failing the housing delivery test and strategic sites, in their view, not delivering as expected, as the district plan initially expected, that other sites should be explored. They are stating that the original allocation for 100 units is still, in their view, the correct figure. It would result in only moderate harm to the Aomb, but they say that harm will be caused whether it's 70 or 100. There's no difference there. The only difference being really that with 70 units, you get reduced community benefits. Denton Homes state the strategic allocation at Pease Pottage is located within the Aomb. Well, that had already happened. That had already been committed by the time of the district plan. So the district plan was taking on board what was a reality at the time. And then they're referring to an alternative emission sites within that area. Sigma Planning for Ryden Homes Limited, that the extent of the development within the Aomb should be limited. The term major development should be considered in the light of the definition set out in footnote 55 and paragraph 172 of the MPPF. I'm tempted to say if only it were that simple, because what you get there are a series of principles on the importance of context, but you don't get numbers. And many people say that's quite right, but it means that it's often a very finely tuned decision. Again, it was something we talked about in some detail last week. I don't know if Mr. Brown wants to start on this one or let other people come in first.
Thank you, sir. Why don't I start? As so you've indicated, this is ground that we've trodden at least once so far in this examination. In particular, it's an issue that arose under the discussion of sustainability appraisal, reasonable alternatives. It arose in the context of main matter 2, which was the distribution of housing in the district. And it also arose in the context of main matter 3.3, where we went through a number of the specific site selections. And so, sir, I apologise if what I'm about to say goes over some of that ground, but I know that there are 1 or 2 people who are down to appear today who I know haven't been here before. So it may be helpful if I just briefly summarise the council's overall position. So we've said from the outset, the site allocations DPD is a daughter document. The district plan itself specifically contemplates that there will be a level of development in the Aomb to support the existing settlements that are there. And frequent reference has been made to the report of your colleague, Jonathan Bohr, who examined the district plan. It was very clear that it was possible to do that without significant adverse effects for the Aomb. He was equally clear that there was no need for major development in the Aomb. And so in our view, that is entirely consistent with the NPPF. There is no policy bar to modest development in the Aomb. Obviously, the character of the appearance of the Aomb matter of considerable importance, but there's no policy bar itself to modest development which respects those things. What there is in the NPPF is a very clear statement that major development should only be allowed in exceptional circumstances. And so you will know that that is the approach that the council has taken. It is our view that there is no need for major development in the Aomb. It is the council's view that none of the Aomb sites that it is putting forward constitute major development. We recognise that that is a subject of debate, in particular in relation to SA25. But I note, for example, that DHA are raising similar issues about SA27 and 29. But sir, in terms of the representations that you've summarised today, that overall pattern or shape seems to be consistent with the view that most people have taken. On the whole, the participants today have recognised that there is scope for development in the Aomb, and indeed a number of them support modest levels of development there. The question really is whether the council is right in its classification of particular sites, and SA25 in particular, as being not major development. So on that issue, as we indicated last week, we've set out the methodology by which we've made that decision. We've been through everybody talks about the Merici opinions, but the reason why they're important is not because James Merici is a well-known barrister, but because actually a lot of the advice that he gave has since been endorsed by the courts. We've been through those judgments, we've highlighted the criteria which have been identified there, and we've applied them across the board in a consistent way. There's a clear methodology, it's been applied. If people can disagree with conclusions, then they can explain that disagreement to you, and you'll form a view on them, sir. But as far as we are concerned, we've certainly taken the guidance and the legal principles on board, and we've applied those. You invited comments, sir, in relation to the reliance that's been placed in some of the representations before you on previous appeal decisions. And so that goes back to the submission that I made last week. First of all, to the extent that some of those appeal decisions, and there are one or two, they tend to be the older ones which predate the case law, some of those hang their hat on the 10 dwellings or more, which is the definition of major development in the Development Management Procedure Order. So you know, because the case law tells you very clearly, that is major development in that context is not what the NPPF is talking about when it refers to major development. They are two different things. A major development in the context of the Aomb, it is a site-specific judgment that has to be made with regard to the various considerations that are there. And so, as we discussed last week, there are cases that go down to 6 dwellings, which have been found to be major development. We gave you examples of recent inspectors' decisions going up to 65, where it's been held not to be major development. And so, without going through each of the particular cases, the simple point that I would extract from the case law is you can't point to another decision and say it said 42 units or 35 units or 50 units or whatever number it arrives at is major development. Therefore, that is the threshold. There is no numerical threshold. It is always a judgment to be made in the particular circumstances. And that is what we've done in the case of all of the Aomb allocations in the plan. People can and will, I'm sure, comment on whether they agree with those conclusions, but it's been a judgment reached on the basis of a consistent methodology applied throughout. Thanks, sir.
That was very concise. Thank you very much for that. I'll bring in other parties now. We've got another quarter of an hour or so before we'll break for coffee, so we can take 1 or 2 more people. Now, who would like to come in? Right, Chris Huff, do come in.
Thank you, sir. Yes, just really in response to your comments on footnote 55. First point I'd like to make is I think the council have got the balance right in terms of the allocations they've identified here. There is a need for some development in the Aomb, if only to support the vitality and viability of settlements in the Aomb, meet local needs, and to support the rural economy. So some needs to be in the Aomb. I think, as we've discussed before, the balance is about right. but any future additions, which we've discussed in great detail, should be focused outside the AONB, which is the point that I'm making, that there should be limits to the amount of development, strategic development, that is directed to the AONB. But particularly in relation to your question about whether there should be a definition of major development in the context of Mid-Sussex. And I noted your comment about the need for, or the lack of certainty. I'm afraid it is one of the frustrations, certainly to me, of planning generally, that it is not a matter of certainty. It's a question of judgment in each case between a balance between competing objectives, and therefore it can only be made by individual judgments. I'm more frustrated about the lack of certainty of phrases such as consistent with local character, which I have to grapple with almost daily, and you could have as many different views on what that is in each individual case. But I think the guidance we're given in footnote 55, this is national guidance, it's a national policy, it needs to be consistently determined on a national basis. And I draw your attention specifically to the wording which says in footnote 55, whether a proposal is major development. So the guidance is focusing on decisions being made on individual proposals rather than having an overall definition for Mid-Sussex and another definition for Mid-Oxfordshire and another definition for Northumberland. I think that's my answer to your question, is that we have got that guidance. I agree with you, it's very uncertain and very frustrating, but hey, that's planning. Thank you, sir.
Yes, that is planning. It's a bit late for me to change my course of attack at my time of life, but yeah, that's true, that is planning. Have I got any more people that wish to speak on this? Michael Brown, CPRE.
So I think I've fired most of my guns in earlier hearings, but since we're looking holistically now at ANOB considerations and sustainability of development within the High Weald, I'd like just to put a couple of things on the record today, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
The principle of some modest development within the High Weald has not been and is not challenged by CPRE Sussex. Chris Huff is absolutely right. Vitality of local communities is important and a key feature of any sensible plan. But I simply cannot see the sustainability argument of encouraging development and allocating sites within the High Weald at this point to a degree that exceeds the local need of communities. We have a situation, and I gave you the figures on day one of the hearings, where the High Weald is under very extreme pressure from development, the most pressured ANOB within the country, which is probably not surprising given its location close to London and the coast, where Mid-Sussex, including the allocations proposed here, will have entered into commitments for development for over 1,500 houses within its small section of the High Weald, just 11% of the total area of the High Weald. in that context, it seems to me all the more important that it should be looking to minimize the level of development that exceeds local need within Mid Sussex, especially given that there are a whole range of sites that have been proposed to the council outside the ANOB, which are potentially at least as sustainable as high-wheeled larger sites. Looking momentarily at the Ardingly case, Paul Brown is, of course, absolutely correct that numbers of houses is not the sole and dominant criterion by which major development is calculated. It is one of 4 factors within footnote 55. But by any measure, 70 homes at Ardingly is a large development. The second factor that is particularly important in footnote 55 is the impact on the ANOB. And whilst the council keep talking about modest impact, I repeat what I said to you the other day, which is that is not the conclusion that was reached in the detailed assessment, where it talked about a moderate risk of significant adverse impact. And a risk of significant adverse impact cannot properly be summarized as modest impact. And that is a significant factor in its own right in the determination of whether a site is major or not. It makes no sense to me that we're trying to put houses, market housing, within Ardingly, which is, as you will see, well, you have seen from your first site visit, and will see again when you revisit the site, is totally car-dependent community. It's some miles from the local resources on which all the residents are dependent. And it is surely, when the council talks about the sustainability of its site allocations, important to consider the degree of dependence of that community on the cars to access even basic shopping. So I say to you again, sir, we do need to look again as part of this exercise as to really whether which developments within the high wheels are truly sustainable, which of them are major and which are not. It doesn't, at the end of the day, matter to my argument about the Ardingly site whether or not it is major, though I think it is, because the fault line in that particular allocation comes from the unsustainability of choosing a site for housing excessive local needs within such a high-pressured ANOB, and when it is so car dependent. And I ask you to take those factors on board in considering how best to conserve the ANOB, which is the statutory purpose for which it was designated. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. I'll take one more comment before we break for the middle of the morning. And so that's Michael Brown who's just spoken. Is anybody else who wishes to raise their hand on this one? Helena Griffiths, good morning. The floor is yours.
Morning, sir.
Morning.
For those who haven't been in some of the other hearing days, my name's Helena Griffiths. I'm a resident of Horsted Canes. I've been following the district plan, the neighbourhood plan and planning process for the last 5 or 6 years now. Today, I'm sort of speaking on behalf of Horsted Canes residents, really. As a resident of the AOMB, yes, I am supportive of some development actually within the AOMB, but it has to be in the appropriate locations. SA28 and SA29 are 2 sites within Horsted Canes that have been allocated. but I don't believe that they're justified because I think this development is actually major development for Horsted Canes. Horsted Canes, the allocations of SA 28 and 29 will increase the housing numbers by 12% in Horsted Canes. And actually, I feel that's major development, especially for a particular timeline, because both of those allocations suggest that they will be finished within the first 1 to 5 years. So actually condensing those down rather than spreading them out over the time of the plan. Horsted Canes is actually one of the few villages in the district which is only served by C roads. We don't have any B roads or any A roads, so the impact on traffic of those two developments over that short time span would also be a greater impact. I believe that the density and scale that are proposed by both of those sites do not enhance the biodiversity of the AONB, because both of those sites sit on medieval green fields, and both of those sites have a high level of completeness of medieval fields, both being over 70% of the original area of the medieval field. SA 29, as we've discussed before, the access actually threatens trees along the access route, with over 35% of the RPAs being covered, where only 20% is recommended in BS 5837. The impact on those trees is also through the reduction of the canopy above that access road by up to 40%. No buffer, looking at the application, which obviously you as the inspector, sir, can't really make comment on, but through that application, we've been able to see how a housing development of 30 houses over 1.13 hectares will actually look. The current outline in the application shows no buffer along all of the tree hedge lines around the site. That means that no foraging bats or wild owls will actually be maintained along the hedge lines that have a very close location to houses. No surface water subsystem is able to be provided on the site because the site is very cramped. Again, that's a recommendation by the AOMB to have a surface subsystem. There's no suitable transition into the built-up area boundary, from the built-up area boundary. That again is suggested that the transition is gradual, and the adjoining field systems are also medieval field systems. So are there sites elsewhere? I believe there are sites elsewhere. I've again highlighted to you these already, but I think the the allocations within Horsted Canes haven't really had a good site selection process due to the lack of due diligence. And also there's been a failure to test those two sites against reasonable alternatives. Regarding major development and that definition, I actually don't believe that definition should be a singular number of houses within the AOMB or elsewhere. I think it's imperative that it's actually a density that is considered, because a high density site within these areas is also an issue. So yeah, I'm very much looking for sites that are appropriate and have proportionate density to properly be able to assess the site, and also other impacts on the AOMB. Yeah, probably. So not just a land, well, yes, actually a landscape-led approach. As I discussed previously, I'm not sure that really a landscape-led process has been facilitated for SA 29. The housing density of SA 29 is 26.5 dpha. Again, highlighting that is the highest greenfield density, not just within the AOMB, but within the whole of the district plan. The allocation of 30 units on SA 29 is disproportionate. Yeah, again, that number means that there's very little meaningful mitigation of the loss of the medieval field and also the field boundary biodiversity. With the current outline plan with the application, only 10% of the site is actually allocated to wildlife. And I don't believe that just replacing a hayfield with a sown verge alongside of a road of 10% of the area is actually a measurable increase in biodiversity. Yeah, just to highlight, I think that there are small scale sites available within Horsted Canes. It's the lack of due process that have actually screened out those sites. And just referring to the future of the planning system, which is a paper that was recently released by the government. And admittedly, it is looking at the way forward for the planning system, but paragraph 144 states that there is public support for prioritising previously developed sites. But in general, the public are actually very unhappy about the perception of this not taking place. This is exactly how residents in Horsted Canes view the district plan currently. They see that previously developed sites have been ignored and replaced by medieval field sites being allocated. So I think there is scope for previously developed sites and small scale sites to be developed within Horsted Canes, and I don't believe that the allocations follow that. And I don't believe that the allocations actually successfully mitigate any of the issues raised by developing a greenfield site. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for that. We'll take a break from now. It's 11:30 now. Sorry, it's 11 o'clock now, and we'll come back at 11:20. Thank you. Right, we're 11:20, so presumably we're back on air.
Yep.
Yep, so we can start again. So the session is now back in progress again. It's 11:20. We're still on the AOMB. If there are any final comments from any parties who wish to say anything, now is your time. Guy Dixon from Savills, good morning.
Good morning, sir. Just check that you can hear me clearly.
I can hear you and I can see your team.
Perfect, thank you very much. So Guy Dixon from Savills Planning, representing Charterhouse, joined around the table by Oliver Taylor opposite me from Charterhouse, Olivia Glenn next to him from Charterhouse, and my colleague Graham Wilson, as previously, so good morning. So just very briefly, I wanted to come back on Mr. Brown's and Mr. Michael Brown's comments in respect of sustainability of site SA25. I'll be brief because it's largely repeating points and evidence that's already before you, sir. But I would just note that in respect of his comments about the lack of sustainability of SA25, the council have quite clearly been through a detailed site assessment, particularly their stage 2 assessments, which balanced the various facets of sustainability and concluded that it was appropriate to allocate that scale of site within the village because of the range of facilities, employment opportunities, and its accessibility. In particular, I would note that I've firsthand seen secondary school pupils queuing up in the centre of the village to take the buses to Haywards Heath to deliver them to school. There is an hourly bus service at peak time, and it's every 2 hours off peak, which connects to Crawley and to Haywards Heath. So, as I've said before, it's no ordinary Category 3 settlement. There are over 300 jobs provided at Ardingly College in the village, as well as further employers based on the showground itself. So we believe that there are genuine sustainability grounds to warrant an allocation of this scale in the village. So I just wanted to come back on those particular aspects. So thank you.
Thank you. Right. Helena Griffiths talked about the importance of medieval field systems within the AOMB, in particular in relation to Horsted Canes. But I just wondered what the situation was at SA25. Do we have a medieval field system there or not? Can anybody help me with that? David Murray, you've put your hand, Murray Cox, you put your hand up. Is that in relation to my question or something?
No, sorry. I put it up to make a point about the AOMB, took it down and accidentally, and then have put it back up again. But I can't answer your question there. Sorry. That's
all right. Was there anything else you wanted to say, or was it just an accidental hand?
Well, no, it wasn't. Originally, it was an intentional hand.
Right.
You've heard from me about the AOMB previously and the growth of Crawley and its significant unmet need. And I'll just make it briefly now because you've heard the point already. But if Crawley is to grow, then almost certainly that's to the south and not the north because of the issues of those other authorities and their ability to accommodate Crawley's housing. If it's going to happen in mid-Sussex, that almost certainly means that to do it in a sustainable and accessible way, that means it's in the AOMB adjacent to Crawley, because the vast majority of the two authorities' boundaries is within the AOMB. And we've previously suggested to you that you should avoid unintended consequences by deciding that there shouldn't be growth in the AOMB, whether that's major or minor or whatever it might be. Because that might be taken as prejudicing or predetermining the future growth of Crawley adjacent to its own boundaries, when in reality that's the most sustainable and accessible way of it taking place. That's the point, but I'll take my hand down now and let you get back to historic field
What would you say to the argument that the M23 is the obvious permanent boundary to Crawley forever and a day?
There are parts of the boundary between the two where there's land to the west of the M23 and the A23. I think the Pease Pottage strategic allocation in the district plan has shown that there are locations where that might be breached in any event.
Okay, thank you for that.
Thank you, sir.
Is anybody able to answer my question about the medieval field system in SA or in and around SA 25?
So I don't know if anybody from SA 5 is able to speak to it, but just thinking back to the conversation last week about the distinction that's drawn on SA 25 between the area that's allocated for housing and the area of green space that is set out there, you'll remember that there was reference to the fact that one of the things that the allocation would do is reinstate a historic hedgerow, of which at the moment I think there is only a single oak tree remaining. So I don't know, but I infer from that that the historic field pattern has been significantly changed. What you see at the moment is almost certainly a 20th century agricultural field pattern, with the proposal that would in fact reinstate the more historic field pattern.
And that was something which I'm hoping is going to come on this map that I can look at to guide me on Friday.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Eleanor Griffiths, I rather cut you off. Was there a point you wanted to make?
No, Mr. Brown has covered the points. I was just going to highlight the fact that the existing tree was an old field boundary.
Oh, right, thank you. Okay, we've got it confirmed from 2 witnesses now. That's helpful. If there's no more comments, he says with trepidation, on the AOMB, we can move on. Right, we're going to move on. And we're going to look at SA 38 in relation to air quality. Now, I don't know whether the council want to hold their fire because they're doing a note on these final policies, or whether there was anything that was needed to be said at this stage. But I mean, it is there as a question to be discussed. And I'll just go through the comments that people have made about it. There aren't too many. Council obviously is going to replace DP29. It's informed by air quality modelling, both in relation to the Stone Pound Crossroads AQMA and Ashdown Forest. The policy is justified and effective. And CPRE, that they basically feel it's more of a platitude than a policy. Therefore, they're quite critical about it. The policy needs to have air quality measuring, monitoring and improvement within it. I suppose my question there is, has CPRE got anything they'd like to suggest in its place? So I wonder if I can come to CPRE first and just try and pursue that question about where do we go from here if we don't like the policy, assuming the policy stays in the plan, subject to the council's note on this. So I'll assume it is for the time being. Michael Brown, do come in and help us on this, please.
Thank you, sir. I seem to be taking up an inordinate amount of your time this morning, and you may think that CPRE's only purpose is to stick pins into Mid-Sussex Council's plan, which by and large we've been supportive of, with exceptions. I don't come with you to you today with an alternative policy wording. I am concerned that if you look at the policy as it's drafted before you, you can't actually discern anything significantly useful in it as a policy at all. It doesn't actually tell you when you read it what pollutants get monitored. It doesn't, for example, in response to one of your questions, even mention that they intend to monitor harm from ingesting small particulate matter shed by passing vehicle tires on busy roads as something that is significant to monitor. It doesn't tell you what the criteria are by which pollutants should be monitored and assessed. And apart from the Stone Pounds air quality management area and the monitoring of Ashdown Forest for nitrogen deposition, it doesn't tell you where, if anywhere, monitoring for pollutants should occur. And the clear implication from the answer that Mid Sussex has given to you about your question is that air quality in the rest of the district is kind of overlooked and barely taken into account. And we don't think we think you need a policy which is clear on its own terms as to what it is that has to be monitored, that isn't focused solely on the major development sites and the single known aqua area. Air pollution is a product across the district from a range of factors, including extending development within the district, inevitable extending development. Whilst Mid Sussex may be a rural authority, it doesn't make the importance of good and improving air quality any less important. Nor does it make Mid Sussex immune to the risk of air pollution. And a complacent air quality policy has no place in any local authority's plan. We want to see something which is proactive in promoting human health and well-being, proper monitoring for the health of biodiversity throughout the district, not only Ashdown Forest, and that works to reduce global warming. Of course, it has to be a proportionate policy, but it has to be proportionate to the gravity of the risks that it's faced. There's no mention, for example, of Gatwick Airport, which is heavily overflown, with Mid Sussex is heavily overflown by air traffic coming in and out of Gatwick, and it's the cause of a great deal of traffic movement for people working at or travelling to and from the airport. And none of that gets any mention anywhere in the policy at all.
I'll just stop you there for a minute, Mr. Brown.
Yeah.
You mentioned Gatwick, and obviously it's a key generator. What do you think this plan could actually do other than mention it that would actually have some sort of positive effect?
Well, a clear strategic climate change policy on reducing the extent of car use in and out would help. A policy from the district council as to the working with others to develop a strategy within the airport for the degree of use of Gatwick would itself be helpful. There's a big debate about whether Gatwick should be expanded or not, and if so, how it should be expanded, and where any future housing should go to expand any growth is all part of an integrated policy, of which air pollution is one just part. And it's.
Do you think this is the role of a site allocations plan to do this, or do you think this is the role of the local plan review at a strategic level to do this?
Well, in a way, the council is hoisted by its own petard of having promoted the need for an updated policy, a recognition that the DP policy 29 isn't good enough. In promoting a changed policy, they ought to be promoting one which works effectively. If there are going to be other major modifications to the site allocations DPD, and I don't know whether there will be, there's no reason why, as part of those major modifications, they can't bring back a more proactive policy with clear criteria as to what is to be monitored and where and how as part of that major modifications. If there aren't going to be other major modifications, perhaps it does have to wait.
I'm just concerned that if it's going to take a long time, like we talked about with climate change, and no 15 months, whatever, then that's defeating the object of getting this plan out quickly, which is what I'm committed to do and what the council's committed to do. And whether the best,
which I would support. I'm looking.
Just if I just finish my point there, that whether it's better to sort of just row back and have the policy they've already got in the district plan at this stage, if you're saying this one's not adding any value, whether we go down an intermediate route again, like we were talking about with climate change, or whether in fact we just do some major work and just have something in the plan about committing to that major work.
I think my answer would be that the amount of work to get an effective pollution policy would not be a major exercise of the order of a detailed climate change review, which affects every other policy within the plan. It can be a self-contained policy, which establishes and just documents what is to be monitored, where and how, and how regularly, and make it clear that it's monitored across the district and not purely at existing known pinch points.
What you're saying is like the makings of a reasonable policy. And I wonder whether that's something you could do a note to the council on and get their response to. If you could do that in the next few days, that would be very helpful. How busy are you?
I've not been invited to draft local plan policies before. I will be happy to put together a note which might provide a framework for them to discuss with you and with CPRE or anybody else they wish to do so.
All I would say is in my guidance notes, I do say that if anybody is critical of a policy, I invite them quite strongly to actually put forward something in its place. So I'm sure the council, as ever, is willing to consider other people's ideas when they're positive, and you're a positive sort of person. And if you can put something to the council or the makings of a policy, and then the council could consider that. It's like the reverse way to the way I'm doing it most of the time. So rather than the council coming forward, you're coming forward, and then the council have a 7 days response to what you say. So I invite you to do that. That'll be very helpful.
I would be pleased to assist. Is this something I deal directly with the council, or is this through this plan process, please?
Do it through the plan process. Talk to Charlotte about it. What I'll put it down as an action point. We're about 15 or 16 now, so you're not the only person that's been picked up on this. And although the council are bearing the brunt of this, but I've done one on my own. I've even given myself work to do on this, so I never learn. But we will put yours down with the others. And as I say, there's a well-worn procedure on this. You don't have any pressure to produce it, but once you do, anybody responding it has got 7 days in which to come back to me with either they agree with it, or they feel it's the wrong time, the wrong place, or they feel, yes, that's quite a helpful idea, or whatever. It's not for me to put words in the council mouths, it's for them to respond to whatever you would like to put to us. And I see that as all part of the kind of collaborative working that we have with local planning examinations.
I would be pleased to work with the council on that. I won't be seeking to put words in their mouths, but I will.
I'm sure you wouldn't.
Something.
Thank you for that. Does anybody else want to talk about air quality at this stage, or shall we move on to talk about the national park?
Before we go on to talk about the national park, and just in case it helps Mr. Brown's note, can I just set out a couple of points?
Of course.
And so this is all on the assumption that having a policy like SA38 is appropriate, which I know is a matter that you're considering under that separate issue. Obviously, if you think it's not appropriate, then this whole discussion becomes redundant in one sense. So I think key headline points that I would like Mr. Brown to take away and think about when he's writing his suggested policy. Mid Sussex cannot dictate the policy for the growth of Gatwick. It's not our area. At best, it's a matter for the local plan where Gatwick lies. Indeed, arguably, it's a matter for a national policy statement, but it's certainly not something that it's appropriate for Mid Sussex to deal with. Secondly, SA38 is a policy about air quality. You've already heard separately from Mr. Brown his request, or CPRE's request, for a policy on climate change. But so you will appreciate climate change and air quality are two very different things. Global warming, greenhouse gas emissions, yes, it's all gases and whatever, but this is about air quality, and that's not the same thing at all. And we think it's very important that the two are not confused. Third, the policy itself, I mean, I've heard what Mr. Brown says, but actually it is a policy that is broadly drafted because it applies across the district as a whole. Inevitably, if you're going to do that, it's going to have a degree of breadth about it. You could be more specific if you were directing it to particular air quality management areas or particular sites where things that were known. But the reality is that when you apply the general policy to a particular location, you will inevitably take into account the circumstances that are specific to that location. But to the extent that Brown's identified a particular concern about particulates, so as I'm instructed, and I think as we've indicated in our response to you on this, neither for the Ashdown Forest nor for any of the air quality management areas in the district are particulates the particular cause of concern. There may be other issues in relation to air quality where we are at or near thresholds or over thresholds, but particulates are not among them. And in those circumstances, highlighting or separating out particulates doesn't seem to us at the moment to make a great deal of sense. I mean, by all means, Mr. Brown can suggest it, but I simply flag that we're going to need some persuading on that issue, and it's a matter that I ask him to reflect on. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I'll leave it there. That's been very helpful comments from all round, and we'll move on to matter 4.4. And my question is, do any of the proposed site allocations threaten to harm the setting of the South Downs National Park? And if so, can effective mitigation be achieved? And I have to say that we are going to have a separate day to discuss this. There will be an extra hearing, which we talked about last week. It will follow on from the site visits, which we've got planned, I think, for Thursday morning, looking from the South Downs various viewpoints onto sites SA12 and SA13. I'm happy to have some discussion now with parties, but it won't be the final. It won't be the final say. And if those parties wish to come back and debate on another day, obviously they're welcome to do so. The council do state that SA12 and SA13 are the subject of ongoing dialogue between the SNDP and the council, and in particular whether they would erode the rural buffer and setting of the national park. that the site visit developers have commissioned the LVIA to show the yield can be achieved and to inform the site layout and landscape mitigation. Pegasus, representing Persimmon Homes and Thacombe Homes, refer to the LVIA that they've already done and which we spoke about last week. And we had a barrister there who helped us on that. And Heather Sargent, I think it was. And basically their view is that from the distance of about 4.5 kilometres, you would not see much that was discernible to the naked eye. I'm quoting now from their report, which says any glimpse of views of the new houses would read as a continuation of the existing built-up area of Burgess Hill, set within a mature landscape framework of retained field boundaries and mature trees, and that their final comment that they make is that the impact of the proposed development, SA13, upon the setting of the national park will therefore be negligible. The South Downs National Park Authority themselves state concerns on SA 12 and 13, and that they consider this SA 13 in particular contributes positively to the setting of the SDMP, and that they'll be happy to work with the council on this. And as I alluded to at the start of this, that working together, as I understand, started. We are meeting, as I said, on site on Thursday. Following that, both those parties, and I don't know whether this will involve Pegasus or not, but I don't see why it shouldn't. But certainly some form of joint note will be considered. That may or may not be possible, but in any event, there'll be some sort of paper put to me, or statement of common ground, or separate notes. And I don't want to preempt which way that's going to go, but it will follow the site visit. And once that's been prepared, then that will be something that will go in the examination library so everybody can see it. And then at a reasonable period following that, we will hold this final day of hearings just to discuss the impact of development in this plan, or proposed by this plan, on the national park. I think that's probably all I need to say now. With those caveats, I'm willing to take any comments from any parties. So it seems as if people are going to wait until we have this day, when with the benefit of the site visit, maybe some additional LVIA work as well, forgot to mention that, plus a paper or papers, then we'll be in a better position to debate this than now. And that is, I imagine, the reason why the South Downs haven't turned up now, because they realise that's the procedure that's now been agreed with the council. And I don't want to muddy the waters. So in that case, we can move on. And we come on to the point that I had to cut Mr. Lopez down in his prime on. I probably should have done that a bit earlier, so I do apologise for that. I've just taken away with your fluency, Mr. Lopez. But what we will do is we'll come back to this now. And basically, the question is the provision of a suitable alternative natural green space, a SANG, is set out in the District Plan Policy DP17 to reduce the likelihood of visitor pressure on Ashdown Forest. And I ask, is it the role of this plan to specify on a map the geographical extent of the 33-hectare SANG at East Court and Ashplatts Wood in East Grinstead? Is there a target date for implementation, and are there convenient public access arrangements? And the council's response is that DP17 in the adopted district plan sets out an avoidance and mitigation strategy for reducing the impact of recreational disturbance on Ashdown Forest. that there is a partnership-based approach, that we have this operational SANG occupying 43 hectares on site. Oh, that's on the western side of SA20, sorry. So we've got two things. We've got the East Court, Ashpratts Wood, there's one. And then we've got the SA20, which that policy includes a 43 hectares on-site SANG on the western side of the allocation. And this proposed SANG has the capacity to accommodate the number of dwellings, i.e. 550 from SA20, as well as sufficient capacity to meet the other proposed site allocations in the DPD that will require SANG mitigation. And the council put that figure as 426 dwellings. So we're talking about virtually 1,000 dwellings worth. That the HRA recommends SANGs should be an integral part of plan making and advises that the proposed SANG is in a location that provides a feasible alternative to Ashdown Forest, being well related to the large concentration of growth to the north and west of East Grinstead, and that the SANG will need to be created and implemented prior to the occupation of the first dwelling of site allocation SA20. Yes, that's right. And that's anticipated in 2024-25. That's the first dwellings. So before 2024-25. Council also state that public access arrangements are being planned and the policy is considered therefore to be justified and effective. So we've basically got an operational SANG at Ashplatts Wood. We've got a proposed SANG within SA20, and that proposed SANG is going to account for all the new dwellings, 1,000 dwellings worth from the plan and some commitments as well. DMH Stallard for Welbeck Strategic Land, also because they're involved with SA20, they state that it secures the delivery of the SANG, that it's required to mitigate potential impacts from the greater recreational pressure through the local plan, that it's considered that the SANG would be implemented in the initial phases of development and will deliver suitable public access arrangements, which will be secured through a forthcoming planning application. Infrastructure First are basically alerting me to what they consider to be reasonable scientific doubt about recreational disturbance and having an adverse effect on the integrity of the forest SACCPA. They say that given the paucity of the evidence base, in their view, the only outcome following a proper application of the precautionary approach is that allocations within 7 kilometres of Ashdown Forest be withdrawn from the plan. They have said a lot more than that. I've summarised that very briefly, as I have the other parties. That's where we are now. I wonder, Mr. Lopez, having cut you off before, maybe I ought to invite you back in now to carry on where you left off, and then I'll invite other parties, including the council, to comment on what you have to say, if that's all right with you, Mr. Lopez.
Thank you, sir. It is, and thank you for your observations on part one. I think this is what you call a second bite opportunity. But can I just float one opportunity? I don't know whether it's worth hearing from DMH Stallard first and then hearing from us, because I've had a part one opportunity. I'm content to proceed now, but I wonder whether or not that might be a better way of approaching it.
When you say you've had an opportunity, I'm not expecting you to repeat what you've said. I'm assuming that where I cut you off was before your natural conclusion.
Yeah, I'm not going to rehearse it. Very good, sir.
What I'm inviting you to do is just continue as you would have done about an hour and a half ago. To your natural conclusion, and at that point I would invite DMH Stallard in. I think rather than cut you off into more bits, I'll try and keep you as coherent as I possibly can at this stage in the proceedings.
Thank you, sir. Very good.
Take the floor.
Very good. Thank you. So continuing on then, in terms of the further referencing, I was about to give you under the HRA. I thought that was a helpful exercise to round that off. Note please the date on the HRA. It's the 3rd of March 2020, and that bears particular importance given the conclusions within the HRA. You'll note I was coming on to paragraph 6.7 within the conclusions, which rather speaks to the exercise often under an HRA. It's an ongoing iterative exercise is the emphasis of paragraph 6.7, but that rather was begging the opportunity, which has not been exercised by the council, we simply don't know why, to undertake further work through not least the medium of provision of monitoring, whether by way of visitor surveys at the Ashdown SPA itself, or, and in addition to that, as we will come on to say, was a necessary component of adequate monitoring at the site of the operational SANG, in order to demonstrate a clear pattern of alleviation of recreational pressures away from the SPA. So note please 6.7 in the HRA, what it is doing is underscoring the iterative exercise that simply hasn't been exploited by Mid Sussex. And so the conclusion then in terms of the overarching duty, so a further reference for you in the HRA, I commend to you, albeit it's in shorthand fashion, Appendix 1, which speaks to the legal duty, which originates from the directive, as you're aware, transposed through the regulations, and to read alongside it the precautionary principle. Now, on reflection, I don't quite think the wording that featured within our representation was as tight as it should be. So can I tighten that up, sir, and perhaps deviate from how it's framed within Appendix 1 of the representation of the HRA, because that puts it this way, that you have to be sure in terms of impacts not occurring, and that doesn't quite get it right either. So it's no adverse effect on the integrity of the SPA. And that's the sort of very high and important bar that is set, not incompatibly with the principle of precaution, which must be objectively demonstrated. And so I was floating the idea of whether or not you should be further equipped with the first communication for the European Commission, which speaks to that high bar. I don't think you do need it. I'm content that you proceed on the shorthand basis of Appendix 1 on the HRA. But when you read that, and then you turn to the conclusions, and then simply to underscore what I said before, but hopefully not repeat, where the representation from Natural England has, I think, been misunderstood or extended by the council, and it may be that DMH Stallard make the same mistake, respectfully, is that nobody can point you to what is a grand lacuna in the evidence base in terms of monitoring, which should, consistently with the iterative process, have been continued to be carried out from 2016 on the Ashdown SPA, or from 2013, actually it's an and, at Ashplatts, in order to objectively demonstrate, and that's the task underlying the precautionary principle and the legal duty, to objectively demonstrate no adverse effect on the site. It's not therefore an ambition to satisfy oneself at a future date unknown. And by the way, the council don't offer you a future date. And added to that, if I can just anticipate perhaps where the council may come from in terms of seeking to provide you comfort on this issue, and we say that they can't. One aspect may be, well, look to the Thames Valley Heath SPA, and that provides for us a sound exemplar in terms of mitigation moving forwards and alleviation of recreational pressures from the SPA. But that respectfully would be a red herring, for these sorts of assessments are site specific, and I needn't look any further than the HRA to ascertain that. So the HRA itself tells you in terms that there needs to be an ongoing monitoring strategy. It's not an exercise, therefore, in simply trying to reproduce from another SPA a strategy that may or may not have proven successful. So that doesn't respectfully assist or take the exercise any further forwards. There may also be a suggestion that as a starting point, the 2016 visitor survey per the Ashdown SPA was adequate and more's to follow, twinned with the 2013 visitor survey at East Court and Ashplatz. Well, of that I say the timing is highly irregular. As I say, it should have been iterative, just as 6.7 in the HRA underscores. But there's a further point, and it is a separate point to that, is that it's not simply a matter of timing, it's a matter of where the surveys are undertaken. So even if, sir, you were content to accept the contention that these monitoring surveys can be picked up, they can be begun again, and that a point hasn't been missed. No monitoring, so far as we understand the picture, has been undertaken at the existing operational SAM. And so what could have been produced is an exemplar closer to home, if I can put it that way, to demonstrate that recreational pressures might likely be alleviated. So it's not only a timing issue. Separately, I make a second point that it's a locational deficiency within the monitoring, the slim monitoring that has been undertaken. But I do underscore that to be a clear deficiency that in turn gives rise to a fundamental problem for meeting the legal duty, and with it failing on the precautionary principle. So you will note the references that I've given to you, sir. There is a final one on Appendix 1, 8.8 paragraph. Again, I just picked that for emphasis, but that does in terms speak to ongoing assessment in terms of checking the adequacy of mitigation so as to objectively demonstrate, not simply anticipate what may be, objectively demonstrate mitigation values, so that you can soundly conclude and legally conclude properly in terms of no adverse effects on integrity of protected sites. So those are the headline extensions to the points that I spoke to earlier this morning. So my apologies for the fragmented nature of it. Can I just round off by adding some further referencing, and then that will be all from me. Please look also to the executive summary that's contained within the Ashdown Forest SPA monitoring strategy. So that's exec summary, please, of the Ashdown Forest SPA monitoring strategy. And that itself, you'll know that
reference that, please.
The document reference.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm struggling on that too. I'll ask my my client to see what, whilst I just round off this point, sir, and I'll try and then find
fine.
for you. So the executive summary on that 2018 document, and you'll know there was a stage in time that was reached by the council where it then adopted that as a formal part of its evidence base, but it seems to be not initially. Now, the crux of the exec summary is that, of course, Mid Sussex are a collaborative partner in the formulation of that document. They don't depart from it one iota. And what the exec summary tells us is monitoring, this is verbatim, and not monitoring is integral to the strategic mitigation package, reading on, monitoring will be necessary to ensure approaches are working as anticipated. And of course, that runs not only for the operational later stage, but also, of course, it does throughout the period of relevant assessment. So you've also, I've made reference to Natural England's objection. Can I twin with that the statement of common ground between the council and Natural England? And you will have seen under section 2 of that, internal pagination page 3 of the statement of common ground, which, and that's another example of ensuring that you're keen to see the specific wording that Natural England use, and then cross-reference that, please, with the specific wording of the conclusion of the HRA. This action group have conducted that very exercise, and that's why it makes the points confidently as it does in terms of the mitigation strategy failing, such that one cannot be properly content to make a finding that would meet with the with a legal duty. And so, so say for that referencing, that takes me to the final point that I might anticipate coming through from the council. It may say to you that this is another exercise in properly understanding how this plan will sit alongside the district plan as a daughter document. But so that can't, if that point were made to you, that can't rescue the position, because first of all, albeit the daughter document excludes strategic policy, the daughter document itself must provide for, it can't exclude consideration through the assessment process of whether or not there be adverse effects on the integrity of protected sites. So one can't defer off the duty, if you like, by reference to the relative status of the daughter document as it sits underneath the, or it will be intended to sit underneath the district plan. So hopefully I've anticipated the points, save for having posited the question of the council at week 1 in terms of where it sits on the monitoring exercise. So those are my points. Let me see if I've got the reference number. We don't, I'm afraid. We don't have an the executive summary itself.
Don't worry, don't waste time on it now. I will find out on that. But thank you for all your help and the substance of your comments. I will take DMH Stallard next. I'm assuming I've got them here. Yes, we've got Katie Lamb. Katie Lamb, yeah, of course.
Thank you very much. You'll be pleased to hear that I don't intend to say very much because, of course, it's the council's HRA which has to support their plan. We haven't assisted with that work, so I will be relying mostly on the council. Just to say that SANGS and SAM has long been the approach for mitigating against potential impacts over the country, but of course on the Ashdown Forest as well. And that's been examined a number of times in absolute detail in adjoining local plan examinations across the patch, notwithstanding the Wealden local plan examination very recently, as SANGS and SAM being appropriate mitigation. And figuratively speaking, to open this discussion again as to whether or not they are appropriate mitigation would be opening up a can of worms. SAM is also a joint, as I understand it, and I'm sure the council will be able to elaborate further on this. SAM is a joint approach between the neighbouring authorities. It's not simply a mid-Sussex strategy. And so a number of other councils have bought into that approach as to assisting in releasing recreational pressure. And just to reiterate, although I'm sure I don't need to say it, that the allocation of SA20 will deliver circa 42 hectares of SANG. That will be appropriately landscaped in relation to the most up-to-date guidance of Natural England, but I believe the council have their own as well. And of course benefits from a number of other wider recreational uses, which does make it an attractive alternative to walking on the Ashdown Forest. That's all I have to say on the matter at the moment, but it may later like to come in. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any other parties before I bring in the council? Michael Brown.
So I've just like to spend a moment on this, on the SANGS question, and open the can of worms that Katie Lamb was concerned should not be opened. Back in 2008 and 2009, a scoping report on the implications of development with it, future development within the district, identified that there is a potential for harm to Dartford warblers and nightingales and possibly woodlark from increasing visitor numbers to the forest. The whole HRA process since then and continuing has hung off that initial scoping report at that time, 12 years ago. to the best of my knowledge, when disturbance to birds is identified, Natural England's traditional response and generic response is the development of a SANG elsewhere, with the purpose of diverting people who would otherwise go to an SPA to visit the SANG instead, to reduce the pressure of visitor numbers on the SPA site. And it's not surprising that Natural England support the principle of using a SANG as a diversionary process in respect of Ashdown Forest as well. The question is it working? Is it working in this case? And to the best of my knowledge, there has been no exercise carried out since the scoping report to identify whether or not the Dartford warblers and the nightingales are increasing in number or reducing in number, or the impacts of continuing visitors to the Ashdown Forest over the last 12 years. Equally, there has been, to my knowledge, no exercise carried out by the council to identify whether the creation of the SANG, the original SANG at East Court, which to the best of my knowledge is the only one that's kind of large one that's operational at the moment, has worked to take people who would otherwise have gone up to Ashdown Forest and diverted them onto the SANG at East Court. And it seems to me that in the absence of any evidence as to whether the SANG is working in this case, it is dangerous to assume that further SANGs to allow further development will be effective to divert visitors and their dogs away from Ashdown Forest, which is the whole and sole purpose of the exercise of creating the SANG and the protection of the bird species that are vulnerable there. That, sir, is all I wish to say. Thank you.
Right, Mr. Lopez, is your hand up intentionally or unintentionally?
No, intentionally, sir. Very briefly, if I may.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Just in relation to one of the points that DMH Stallard made, but I'm grateful to Mr. Brown because he's taken some of the floor from me. It suggested, if I can put it a different way, that the effectiveness of SANG and SAMs, and I have to read this in principle, otherwise it doesn't make sense, is somehow a settled issue. And so that it's not for you to, the phrase was, open the can of worms. Well, I'm afraid that simply doesn't do in terms of the legal duty. It's not an exercise in looking back and looking to the acceptability as if in principle of an existing SANG or SAMs or collaboratively the two. It's an exercise in looking forwards in terms of the adequacy of the mitigation strategy. And as part of an integral component, nothing less, an integral component of that strategy, you are required to assess. And that assessment is iterative. That iterative process is enabled, fundamentally enabled, by the monitoring strategy. So I'm afraid the representation from DMH Stallard, you best have me on record for this. I fundamentally disagree with that, and it invites you into legal error. The second point, sir, you asked for a reference on the document. I'm reminded by my client that for reasons unknown, but I'm sure they can be explained in due course, the Ashdown Forest monitoring strategy was referenced within the bibliography of the HRA, but it hasn't found its way separately into the council's, into the council's evidence base. So we put it in, and the reference for you, sir, is reference 2383, which is Appendix 1 to our matter statement 4.5. So Ref 2383, see Appendix 1, which your programme officer very helpfully received and then added the reference to it. So, so those are my additional 2 points. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. If there are no other parties apart from the council that wish to speak now, I will invite Mr. Brown and his team to respond to these points. I suppose one of the points is this question about, is the strategy working? To put it in a very simple, stark way. I think it'll be helpful to have that addressed. So, Mr. Brown.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to kick off and then I might just turn over to Jennifer Hollingham in case there are any additional details to follow. So I'm going to start by saying your question 4.5 is quite specific. I mean no disrespect to either Mr. Lopez or Mr. Brown, CPRE, if I say that the submissions they've made don't actually address the question that you have particularly posed. What they are in essence doing is raising again a matter that was canvassed in terms of legal compliance on day one of this examination. That doesn't mean, sir, that it's an inappropriate thing to ask. It doesn't mean that there's no connection between it and 4.5, but I'm going to try as I can to both respond to them and then come back to the question that you've set out at 4.5 of your note. So I think it is very, very important to recognise where this begins. And it's implicit in the first sentence of your 4.5, which isn't a question, it's a statement. The provision of SANG is set out in District Plan Policy DP17 to reduce the likelihood of visitor pressure on Ashdown Forest. And so that is absolutely right. And it is that the starting point, the principle of SANG is one which is set out in the district plan. The district plan itself makes some provision for SANG. It also clearly anticipates that to the extent that a daughter document might give rise to additional needs, that daughter document would make sure that the SANG provision was adequate. I'll come to that shortly. But so just in relation to DP17, it is worth noting, and sir, I'm sure you have the point, but it's set out in our response to your matter for MSDC 02D, that is paragraphs 51, 52. It's worth understanding that DP17 is not this council off on a frolic of its own. The concept of SANGs, which is now one that goes back for more than 10 years, is one which is a strategic solution. It is a partnership approach between a number of local authorities. And so as Katie Lamb indicated to you in her response a moment ago, it has been tested through now a number of local plans. It is a tried and tested solution to the problem. That doesn't mean it necessarily works in every single case. Obviously, one needs to make sure one is identifying the right sites. I'll come back to that in a moment. But the basic principle, does SANG work? Is it a way of mitigating impact? So that is something that is very well understood, been tested on a number of occasions. And I hear what Mr. Lopez says about not opening, or the dangers of not opening a can of worms. But in my respectful submission, when Ms. Lamb described it as a can of worms, she was absolutely right. It's not a can of worms, but the consequences for you to find as a matter of principle that SANG is ineffective, or you are not satisfied that it's effective, the consequences of that, sir, are huge and are not limited to Mid-Sussex. Potentially every one of the 6 authorities that we've identified in 5.2 would suddenly discover that they were in territory where they were potentially in breach of the habitats regulations. And so that's a conclusion which, in my submission, you should be extremely slow to come to, particularly when this issue has been addressed now at a number of local plans. So can I then tie that into what Mr. Lopez says about monitoring? And so your question 4.5 refers to the ash flats at SANG. So I think you've asked there, is it the role of the SADPD to specify or map the geographical extent of that? Of course, I think you understand that the SADPD doesn't actually define the ash flats SANG on a map. That's done in the district plan. What the SADPD does is address the new SANG at Imberbourne. But you will have picked up from our answer, just going back to East Court and ash flats, when Mr. Lopez talks about monitoring. So I'm not in any sense going to say to you that there isn't a need for ongoing monitoring in relation to ash flats, but so you need to understand, because your task is assessing not the soundness of the district plan, that's a job that's already been done by your colleague. Your job is to assess the soundness of the SADPD. That the ash flats SANG is effectively already pretty close to capacity in relation to sites that have already been brought forward under the district plan. Whether it works or not is an important question, but it is not a question which is going to help you particularly to form a judgment about whether the SANG provision in the SADPD is likely to be effective. You could ask as many people as you like at ash flats whether they would have gone to the Ashdown Forest or anywhere else. You can survey as many Dartford warblers as you like in the Ashdown Forest, and it won't tell you very much about whether Imberbourne is likely to be effective. So I'm not suggesting that there isn't a need for monitoring, but in terms of the basic question, the soundness of this plan, that doesn't answer that question. As far as the question you do need to address is concerned, so you've got in the plan the area of the SANG identified adjacent to SA20. You will also readily appreciate its proximity to SA19, and so you know that between them, SA19 and SA20 are a very, very significant part of the overall housing provision that's made in this plan. You will note that the proposed SANG is directly adjacent to both of those sites. And so turning back to the question that you've asked, which is entirely relevant for the task that you're charged with, is there a target date for implementation? Are there convenient public access arrangements? So those are matters that you can judge, and indeed whether or not they're in terms of the access arrangements that will be made. This is a SANG that will be within easy walking distance of the two major housing allocations in the SADPD. It is a new SANG which will also be within easy walking distance of an existing and significant area of population. In a world where the general principle of SANG is one that is well established, is there any reason why you should conclude that this particular SANG is not likely to be attractive? The answer to that question in my submission, sir, is emphatically no. This is patently highly accessible. It is patently going to be an attractive place for people to go. And if they do go there, then that will take pressure off the Ashdown Forest. And in terms of access, there is no reason to understand why that cannot be gained easily, why it cannot be gained without the need to get in cars and drive long distances. And in terms of the dates, the target dates for implementation, so you'll find both within our response and also in the DMH Stallard material details of how that will be, is intended to be integrated with these new developments. And so, sir, if you focus on the question with which you are charged, which is not, is the principle of DP17 sound? That's a district plan issue. That's a decision that's already been made. If you're focused on the task with which you are charged, which is there any reason to believe that the mitigation proposed for the allocations in the SADPD will not be sufficient? The answer to that in my submission is clear. There is no reason to doubt the adequacy or the suitability of that mitigation. So that's what I wanted to say. I don't know. Ms. Hollingham is shaking her head to indicate that I've stolen all her thunder, sir. So we'll end there if that's all right. Thank you.
So Ms. Hollywood doesn't want to say anything then, I'll take it.
No, sir. No, thank you.
Right, okay. Mr. Lopez, do come in.
Thank you, sir. My camera's adjusted itself, I see again. Can I just comment, and of course, Mr. Brown must have the last word, but if you feel, sir, that the question that was posed on this matter it's slightly rowing in a different direction, then nonetheless, sir, I think it overlays with the concerns that my client action group has. But the shorthand answer, it follows from our representation on the question that you pose. The existing SANG is, of course, deficient, alongside the need for, as everyone agrees, the proposed or a further proposed mitigation measure. So in shorthand fashion to the answer to the question, existing SANG deficient, where else do we look in terms of assuring ourselves and objectively demonstrating the adequacy of other mitigation measures in conjunction? So first point on the question itself. Second point, flowing from Mr. Brown's submissions, I agree that DE17 as a policy is a starting point, but merely a starting point in terms of answering both your question and the wider question of fundamental interest to you on which this action group has addressed you. In terms of pointing then to the existing SANG, both the ASPLAT SANG and also in principle what's been accepted under policy, it's characterised as being a tried and tested method. But I also agree this of the council, that it doesn't mean that it's adequate of itself in all cases. And what follows from that, that's perfectly right, I agree that, but what follows from that is it recognises that there must be, by way of necessary extension, an adequate assessment, and with it through monitoring. And again, that's the integral method that Mid Sussex have themselves and the documents, the HRA and the shared study joining all of the 6 authorities, isn't it, agree is an integral, so they can't row against that, to explore whether here, this SANG, with regard to these proposed allocations, would prove an adequate mitigation measure. So it's a journey, sir, if you like, from the starting point that one recognises under the policy of the adopted plan, and with it recognition at high level of the principle of SANG, but it doesn't answer the question. The necessary question is proceed with the assessment and establish beyond, sir, you framed it, scientific doubt, but I'll frame it slightly differently, objectively and demonstrably, showing no adverse effect. And one only reaches that end assessment point, the end point, through the ongoing monitoring. And so can I round off on the council's respectfully emphatic confidence that you can make the conclusion that you can in the absence of monitoring, because the council don't seek to suggest that we've missed, as a matter of record, monitoring that has, as a matter of fact, been undertaken. It hasn't. They don't row against, respectfully, and frankly, the documents would shout otherwise in any event, that monitoring is an integral component. To suggest to you that you can have confidence without the integral component of monitoring in the efficacy of the mitigation strategy through the SANG in this instance, sir, respectfully, is beyond us as an action group, because we don't understand how one can say that in one breath, but equally point to the HRA as being their evidence base, and twinned with that the shared strategy of all of the authorities, which says categorically, true to those references I gave you, see Appendix 1 of the HRA, that the monitoring strategy is an essential integral component. And so very lastly, can I respectfully caution against the submission, well, if you row against the in-principle acceptability per the district plan policy for SANG in principle, somehow that's going to disturb the collaborative efforts and good work of the other neighbouring authorities. So that is respectfully not a matter that should dissuade you from conducting the necessary, underscore necessary, interrogation of this proposed SANG in conjunction with these proposed allocations. You will not, if you were to make a finding consistent with this action group's submission, be chucking out the good efforts of the neighbouring authorities. You would rather be conducting the very exercise that is the overriding legal duty. And so you have my submissions. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Brown, Paul Brown.
So,
I think again, I'm looking towards a note on this because we have the objections from Natural England. We have certain comments from the HRA.
you don't have objections to Natural England, sir?
I was told that there was an objection from Natural England.
No.
Mr. Lopez, did I get that wrong?
Slightly, sir. I said representation, so not an objection, but what I did say of the representation is if you read it and you cross-referenced it correctly to the conclusions of the HRA, it would actually be neutral. But I didn't frame it as an objection.
In which case I apologise. So in relation to, I'll speak back to Mr. Brown again. In relation to a neutral finding then of the NE and this whole monitoring thing, I understand what you're saying, that it's tried and tested, and therefore it's been tried and tested in other places. Why do you need to do it here? But it would help me to get an answer from the council as to why I can proceed with confidence in this, in what I'm assuming is the absence of monitoring over quite a substantial period of time. I'm assuming that's the case. There's been nothing back from the council saying the 2013 and 16 dates are wrong. We've had more recent monitoring. I think in the light of the length of time, and obviously clearly we've had COVID in between, so I'm not expecting something that's been very recent, but a note along those lines, I think would help me consider my way, work my way through this difficult can of worms, if you like. If you can do that, Mr. Brown.
Indeed, sir, we can. So can I just say, I understand exactly what Mr. Lopez says when he says, well, just because it might be a can of worms, that doesn't mean you shouldn't go there. And so I should be very clear. I'm not suggesting that you should reach a decision that is legally erroneous just because you're worried about upsetting the apple cart with 6 other authorities. My point is that the territory that we are treading here is well worn. It's been trodden by a number of other local plan inspectors before you. And while, of course, you're not bound by their decisions, you are at liberty to depart from them. It would, in my submission, be surprising if you reached a conclusion that SANG is not sound in principle. So in relation to monitoring, we'll hear what you just said, and we will produce a note. What I would say, just linking it up with the submission that I made previously, is that you can't actually monitor what doesn't exist yet. Imberhorn doesn't exist yet. The way in which to test whether Imberhorn will continue to work as we expect that it should will be to ensure that Imberhorn is monitored throughout its life. And indeed, that will happen. And that is what the plan requires. But I hear what you say about Ashplatz. Right, okay, stand by my original submission. Monitoring of Ashplatz would actually tell you very little, if anything, about the extent to which Imberhorn would be an adequate SANG. But we'll do the note and bring that together for you in any event, sir. Thank you.
That is very helpful. So I'm giving you the last word on this. So that is it for now. And we are closing. We reopen at 2 o'clock and we will look at transport and infrastructure issues. So session is now closed. Thank you.